Hello class and welcome to Experience Design Week 8, Experience Design 2 Week 8. Today's class is going to be about speculative design. What we're going to cover today: what is speculative design? Why is speculative design important? Possible futures, exploring and criticizing, designing artifacts, and speculative design for UX in particular, and compare and contrast traditional versus speculative design. And finally, I'll provide some examples of speculative design from today, or today-ish, and some from the past. The ones from the past are interesting because they show you what they thought the future was going to be like, and it's interesting what they got right and also what they got wrong. What is speculative design? Speculative design aims at exploring and criticizing possible futures by creating speculative, often provocative scenarios narrated through designed artifacts. Well, that's a mouthful. In a nutshell, speculative design means thinking about the future in order to design for it. You know, in many ways, a lot of the stuff that we do in UX and design is to fix existing problems or to streamline processes that already exist, or build new experiences but based on design patterns that already exist, which is great, you know, and that's what we've been learning for most of it. Speculative design is a little bit different. It kind of poses the question, instead of thinking about the past or today, why not think about the future? And let's think about what could happen in the future and how do we get to a point where we have the best possible outcome for the future. There's also other reasons to do speculative design. It's often in a lot of industries, the project you're working on is going to take years to get to completion. If you base your design paradigms on what exists now, it's going to be out of date by the time the product gets released. So just to talk a little bit more about speculative design. So you can think of speculative design as science fiction, but science fiction with a purpose. So, you know, science fiction novels already often tend to take a current trend and extrapolate it into the future and show a future where this has kind of come to fruition, right? So we're doing that. We're kind of thinking about the future in a science fiction-y sort of way. But with the idea of using that as inspiration for the products of today. So why is speculative design important? Designers have the ability to shape the future by the decisions we make today. The ability to shape the future, we have to imagine, to be able to shape the future, we have to be able to imagine what it will be like. Once we have a clear vision, we can work backwards and make decisions today towards that future that we imagine. So I find this obviously kind of interesting. It kind of breaks away from the kind of fine-tuning approach that UX usually presents us. It's like, how do we take this website and make it easier for a user to use? And it's usually about reducing number of clicks, removing friction, removing cognitive load. It's about fine-tuning. It's like taking a car and tuning the engine. Speculative design opens that up with complete creative freedom in terms of the only limits are what you can imagine. And to that note, the project that you're currently working on for this class could be considered speculative design. You know, for many of you, you've selected something that doesn't exist, but could very well exist in the near future, and you're designing towards it. So very much what this class is about is speculative design. You know, in retrospect, this lecture probably should have been earlier in the semester, but you know, whatever. So possible futures. When we talk about the future, we're pretty sure about some of the things that are going to happen. That's the probable future. Like if you look a week or a month away, you can probably see where things are going. But you know, if you look a little bit further down the road, there's, you know, as you look further into the future, there's more and more possibilities of what can happen till the point where it gets almost infinite. But if we think about some of these things that are in the near future that we can influence or affect by our design choices, we can start working towards that today. So here's a little infographic that kind of shows that. You know, there's the probable and there's the preferable future. the future that we want to push towards. We can explore the possible futures by thinking about different areas in life after a certain technological or social change has taken place. This exploration helps to include all types of people into the discussion and democratize it. So far, it's been the huge tech corporations and media like Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google that share their vision of the future and are influencing our picture along the way. I would say Facebook fits in there even more than, say, Netflix. But they're not the only ones that can have a vision. We all can. Exploring and criticizing. Sometimes we show the future by focusing on the good, what would be called a utopian future. I think we all easily can imagine a future that is absolutely preferable, right? We can imagine a future where you don't have to work to live. There's minimum basic income. You just basically work to do passion projects or do something that interests you or you enjoy. We can imagine a world where there's no food shortages. All these kind of things are quite easy to imagine. The reality of getting it that way is not always as easy. Minimum basic income, there's a lot of people that fight against it because they think that people will stop working and productivity will go down. Just as a side note, there's been a bunch of studies on minimum basic income, just to go into detail about what that is. That's the idea that every citizen of a country would get a certain base amount per year. Usually it's usually pegged below the line of poverty, but the idea would be it would be pegged to ideally it'd be pegged to the minimum cost of living, so you can afford to pay for rent, food, etc. There's reasons to think these programs would be more efficient than, say, unemployment insurance and welfare, because both unemployment insurance and welfare both require large numbers of bureaucrats to run those organizations to make sure nobody's cheating. That's a cost in and of itself. If you just, if everybody submits their tax return and the government gives you a check for the difference between what you make and what the established amount is, you don't have to administer programs like that, and it saves money in the long run. There's lots of discussions on both sides of the fence. I think that actually economically, there's many reasons why it makes sense, and it may happen in your lifetimes at least. But I think more traditional conservative people fight against it because they don't like the idea of people getting handouts, which is sort of a strange way of thinking about things. Ever since I was young, I always thought that, if you're a citizen of a country, you shouldn't have to, you should be guaranteed some certain things. Not you shouldn't have to, you should be guaranteed the ability to live, and that should be part of your rights as a citizen. Before we had national healthcare or a single payer healthcare, our system was very much like the States. And now that we have it, we can see how terrible it is that at one point we didn't have it. We just have to look at the States, where people are afraid to go to the hospital. They chopped off a finger and they don't want to go to the emergency ward because they don't want to pay for the ambulance and the cost of treatment at the hospital. And we find it horrifying. But there was a time in Canada where we didn't have it, and it was a long, hard fight to get it. There's always economic forces that work against these perfect ideas. Anyway, that was a digression. We can work towards a future by imagining a utopian future. We can also help push our goals to a better future by looking at a dystopian future. And this is often what ends up happening in science fiction. In Star Trek, every world they went to was basically one kind of element of the human condition kind of writ large and kind of expanded upon. And these usually served as warnings about what we shouldn't do and where we shouldn't go and what can happen if we do that. So sometimes dystopian futures are even more effective at kind of showing us where the error of our ways are. So if any of you have seen Black Mirror on Netflix, I'm sure you all have, and if you haven't, please watch it. It's sometimes over the top, it's sometimes depressing. It is always sort of shocking and eye-opening. Basically, Black Mirror is an anthology series. Anthology means every episode is a different story, like Twilight Zone or something like that. And it focuses on taking one sort of thing of the modern world and expanding it into the future. One of the episodes is a world where social media has kind of taken over, and people are very, very, very worried about what their social standing is. Like, people can, if you meet somebody in a store and you give them a hard time, they can downvote you. So you can be upvoted and downvoted by anybody. And what ends up happening is that if you're downvoted enough, it reduces your ability to do things. You can't rent a car, you can't get a place, stuff like that. China is actually implementing a system like this, so it isn't even near future. It's actually now. There's a social credit component to online media in China. It wraps up more than just kind of people upvoting you. It's also like your credit score and your marks and all that other stuff. And it influences your ability to take out loans and etc. So, I don't think any of us want to be stuck in a world like that. It sounds horrible. Imagine being on guard all the time. Like, I feel bad for small restaurants and businesses. They're at the mercy of Yelp and whatever, review system people are using. Any disgruntled person can go on there and lie or shout their views to a million people about their bad experience. So it makes restaurant owners in particular and shopkeepers kind of cautious when they're dealing with customers. Which there's some benefits. They may be more likely to accept your return of a product because they don't want to have the hassle. So it might make your life easier as a customer, but it's also a bit tyrannical. Anyway, obviously I can talk about all these things for a million years, each slide. So what are you producing when you're doing these speculative designs? And really, it could be anything, right? Like, for example, the projects you're working on right now, the wireframes and the designs you're going to do for your kind of conceptual interface for the product you're working on, those are design artifacts. Artifacts are things, and not even necessarily things, but they're what's left over when you've done your design process, right? So you can consider artwork. The produced artwork is the artifact of the creative method. So if you produce a sculpture, that's the artifact of your creative process to get to that point. But they could be stories, as I just talked about. They could be TV shows, movies, films, etc. They could be stories, like written stories, science fiction novels. It could be wireframes, videos. As you're going to see, that it's a big thing for a lot of tech companies to show that they're on the leading edge by creating videos that predict what the world's going to be like in a few years from now. And like I said, we're going to have a look at some of those. Product design, you could actually produce an object. You know what I mean? You could do, car companies do concept designs for automobiles all the time, where they put out something that's not actually in production, and for the most part never actually does go into production. It's just a way of going, like, wouldn't it be cool if this was the future, Ford Focus. Basically, these artifacts are anything that communicates the possible reality of the future you're talking about. Oh, did I jump ahead there? Sorry. So I in my kind of research for putting together this lecture, I ran across this one thing. It's a bit creepy and weird, and probably falls more on the side of like art than traditional UX design. But I wanted to kind of throw it out there as something kind of weird that can show you how you can propose something unsettling in order to kind of change the way people think about where we are now and the future that's coming. So addressing the potential future issues of overpopulation and species extinction, Japanese designer Ai Hasegawa proposed, "I want to deliver a shark, a future biomedical technology that enables women to use their reproductive systems to birth endangered species that they could also eat." That's the part that creeps me out a little bit. You want to give birth to a shark just so you can eat it? Hasegawa likes to eat dolphin, but recognizes this adds to the animal's endangerment. She also wants to not waste her reproductive system, but doesn't want children. Hasegawa took the concept further by conducting a scientific study to release a scheme of how this could actually work. Now, I just want to point out now, I don't believe that this person actually wants to do this. I think that this is a creative, artistic expression, and it's put out there as a way to go like, what? And make you think, right? By talking about this potential kind of outlandish future it makes you reconsider a bunch of things, like what's the, what does it mean for women to not have children? And is there a near future where that's because I think it's accepted now if you don't want to have children, but I think there's still pressure from your parents and grandparents and even society as a whole. I think if you're a heterosexual couple and you're together for any length of time, you'll start getting those pestering questions. Will there be a future where it's just accepted that people don't want to have children? The other thing is about endangered species. So those two, we're all concerned about it, but maybe is it bad enough that we want to breed endangered species in people's bodies? Anyway, unsettling and disturbing, and I hope none of you were eating breakfast when I read that. But this is the artifact she created. She created like this medical model of a uterus, and inside there's a gestating baby. I think it looks like a baby shark, but maybe it's a dolphin. I don't know. Should look at what the writing is on there. So it's an art piece. It's an artifact that kind of represents what she's talking about. Now, obviously, we're kind of, we're talking mostly about usability and experience design, so we're not really, talking about creating art per se in this class, but I always think it's good to show kind of the outlandish or far out examples. It moves the needle a little bit for what you maybe feel that you can do in your design practice. So I mentioned this before, with current kind of experience design, we are kind of looking at tweaking and fixing existing processes and interfaces and experiences to make them better, or creating new ones, but based on existing design paradigms. And I think this is the most interesting thing, and the thing I want to keep kind of, I've talked about a few times, both last semester and this semester, and I kind of want to keep talking about is that experience design can sometimes get stuck in a rut. I remember when I was working at this company called ICE, we had, they called it information architecture at the time, but it's essentially experience design. And there were a bunch of very skilled, talented people, but I was a designer there, and I was very frustrated by they would dig in their heels if you tried to do anything innovative. They always said, no, it's got to have scroll bars, it's got to have a drop-down menu, it's got to be these existing design patterns. And it really felt stifling from a creative perspective. And I believe that probably 90% of the time it is best, especially if you're trying to sell products online, it's probably best to stick to existing design paradigms. But sometimes you're in a position where you can actually introduce something new or something that's never really been developed to a point. And I don't think that should be stifled by this idea that you have to stick to existing design paradigms, because I think that stifles innovation and leads to things not changing and not getting better. And I think that as a designer, you always want to keep pushing the envelope. You want to create something that's better, more useful. And to do that, you need to take chances. And I think speculative design can provide you with the kind of the narrative that you need to cast to kind of sell that through. If you're talking about the future and how we get to that future through the interface that you're designing. For example, a few of you are working on augmented reality, which there's not really any established design for that yet, and it'll, even when it comes out, it'll probably be based on existing design paradigms, but there'll be an opportunity to invent a whole new paradigm. For example, I remember when I got the Nintendo 64, which was the first kind of 3D video game. It was great. I loved it. It was fantastic. But one of the things that I noticed about it that was difficult to use was controlling the camera. That was something that was, because in a 2D game you've got a fixed view, you can't control a camera. And I remember the camera it hadn't quite been figured out, right? It was very much up to you to move the camera to the exact right place that you needed it to be. Nowadays, we still have the camera, and I've noticed new players, like my daughter, when she first started playing 3D games, the camera really kind of flummoxed her. But we've built in some stuff around the camera that makes it easier to use. For example, if you start walking forward, often the camera will move from where it is to fall behind you. In GTA, when you're driving a car, you kind of do a crazy move and you start driving away, the camera won't stay on like the right side of your car. As you're driving, it'll move to point toward the front. So we've built some logic into that and made the usability easier. So that's one of the things where when it first came out, it was a new thing. People hadn't played with it, but over iterations of designing video games and getting used to it, the camera is pretty much a non-issue now. One of the other things that about the camera in 3D video games is that it used to be if the camera went behind an object in an old video game, you wouldn't be able to see anything. And you'll notice now that whenever the camera does get stuck behind something, that thing usually turns translucent so you can see through it. Video games often have to, sticking to the kind of topic of video games, often have to design for the future. Take Red Dead Redemption 2, which I'm thinking about because I'm actually playing it. I picked it up when it first came out, but I got bogged down by maintaining the camp and I wasn't really enjoying it, so I stopped playing it, even though it was a beautiful game. And I've kind of run out of video games to play, so I picked it up again. I got a new TV and the PS5. And the game is gorgeous, and I'm super enjoying it. And I'm also blown away about how good it looks. Like this is, I think it was released 2 years ago. It beats Cyberpunk, like hands down. But how do you do that? These games aren't in development for a year. These games are in development for a long time. This one was 7 years, nearly a decade it was being developed. How do you develop a game like that and not have it look like an old game when it comes out? And part of it is, incorporating speculative design into it, or making it so that the build of the game is future-proof. And by doing that, you have to extrapolate what's going to be available. Sometimes there's hardware that's available to developers that you don't get, on the open market. And this game was developed for the PS4, so they knew the hardware they were going to play on. But still, there's gaming engines, and gaming engines change. And some of them end up being good, and some of them end up not being so great. But basically, the whole development process has to be built around being able to change for the future and looking to the future to see what's possible. And probably this stuff was scaled up. Like probably when they started, they didn't have volumetric lighting or atmospheric effects. And as those things became capable, they were able to add it in. So the game was flexible enough to be able to adapt to that. I have a double slide here. Another case study is Apple. I know you guys are probably sick of me talking about Apple, and I apologize. And I also spoke about this in my last lecture, the iPhone introduction. I think that's an excellent thing to talk about because, like I said in my previous lecture, they nailed it. They got it right. They came out with something that wasn't based on today's technology. Like, let me just go to the next slide. This is what phones looked like when the iPhone came out. They all had like little screens and keyboards. And some of the screens were touch screens, some of them weren't. I think the BlackBerry had like a little joystick you could use to move around. They were very kludgy. I liked my BlackBerry when I had it. It was great being able to type out things on it. I think that actually from a usability point of view, the physical keyboard has a slight advantage for entering text. But this is what all the phones were like. And anytime somebody put out a new phone, it was basically based on this model, small screen. If it was a touch screen, it was a single touch and it was plastic screen. And sometimes they had styluses. A lot of them had stylus. I think the Trio had a stylus. And this was the model, right? And Steve Jobs and Apple, when they were developing their phone, they decided to take a whole different direction. So what they did is they went, why just use that tiny bit for the screen? If we use the whole screen, if the whole phone is the screen, you'll be able to do a lot more and see a lot more. Now that introduced problems, right? So, plastic screens aren't good at multi-touch. They can be used, and you can see it today, some items. But they're not very responsive. They're a bit laggy, and they bug out sometimes. So one of the things that turned out is that for them to have multi-touch, which they wanted to be able to, so you could control the phone with gestures rather than styluses, required a glass screen for the accuracy they were looking for. So that's one thing, a change from plastic to glass. Now, at the time, a lot of people would said, no, if you drop your phone, the glass is going to smash. And we all know that is true. These older phones, you drop them 1,000 times, they would still keep working. But Apple thought the trade-off to have this much more usable screen was worth the price of sometimes dropping and smashing glass. And I'll tell you, phones are much better now. The original iPhone and for the next few versions, that glass would smash at the drop of a hat. Like if you dropped your phone even with a case, it was a dice roll, like probably 50-50 if it was going to smash or not. So they made that decision. They made the decision to remove the keyboard, but in removing the keyboard, they had to devise a system that came close to the text input of a keyboard. Obviously, you don't have the buttons, you don't have the tactile solution, and your fingers are kind of sloppy on a screen. So they came up with this whole keyboard system where, like, and obviously when you press a key on a touch screen, you don't see what key it is. They have this thing where like the letter comes up above, which we're all used to, but that was like a brand new thing. Nobody had seen that before. And also, because it's hard to type on the screen, you make lots of mistakes, they built in amazing autocomplete. Now, we all have frustrations with our autocomplete. We all get mad at it sometimes, especially when we're trying to say fucking and it changes it to ducking. I almost think Apple does that on purpose. But at this point, it's hard to imagine how much they nailed that and got it right. And that was an absolute requirement. If they'd introduced this full touchscreen phone with a software keyboard that didn't autocorrect very well, the iPhone would not have succeeded. So they had to make a ton of innovations to get this idea of a full screen, a pocket computer where it's a software keyboard, and it would go away when you're viewing content, so it didn't occupy all that space. And they were absolutely right. It created a revolution. The people that own these things, like the things you can see on the screen right now, they were business people and stuff like that. It was the general average public didn't have it. They were too clunky. The internet connections were slow. The web browsing used this thing called WAP, which was a piece of crap. You could kind of work around some sites, but a lot of sites you couldn't at all. So there was a lot of hurdles. There was an advantage if you were a business person and writing a lot of emails and you wanted to be able to do that outside of the office. It was a godsend. But beyond that, it wasn't for everybody. The iPhone, by its introduction, made this kind of portable computing accessible to everybody. And it's hard to imagine now, 12, 13 years later, what a drastic change to society it's made. By making those choices and making this device that's so accessible and so easy to use, and by going against the trend, by not having a stylus, by not having a plastic screen, by not having a physical keyboard, they introduced a device that has revolutionized the world. And I don't think I'm saying that with hyperbole. I think that we can all agree that what's the most panicking moment you can have? You can't find your phone, or your phone is dead and you can't charge. It's like it's mortifying. Like it's frightening to be like suddenly cut off from this whole other world that we've developed. And that world's being developed because of these mobile devices. So I think, Apple is a very great, the introduction of the iPhone is the best in class example of thinking about the future, thinking about what people needed in the future and developing that product today, even if you had to go against the current trends. So yeah, there ends my rant about the iPhone yet again. Okay, I already talked about that kind of stuff. So every UX designer who wants to be great, to make a difference and create something extraordinary, needs to think beyond the tech world of today. If we want to use design to change the status quo, then speculative design is the method you need to invoke in your UX toolkit to do it. So I think we've talked about this already, traditional versus speculative design. Traditional UX design is, like I said, about tweaking things. Speculative is like going like, okay, instead of just like sticking to where we are right now, what could it be in the future? And I think this goes back to, and I've said this in many of my other lectures, is that you as a designer should think of yourself, you're not as something more than somebody who just creates pretty pictures and images. You have the possibility to change the world through your creative thinking and your ability to be able to show that to people. And you should never forget that. And you should always try to do your best to be as accommodating to everybody and try to create the world that you want to see through your design. And you know what? I'm under no illusions. Probably most of you are not going to be the next Steve Jobs or whatever. But even in small decisions that you make on a daily basis in your design practice, you can change things for the better. One small thing is making sure your design is accessible. Or, I'm colorblind. Making sure your charts that you create are accessible to colorblind people. That's one small thing you can do that's maybe an annoyance or a hindrance, but can actually improve design in the whole world. Because that's one thing I take issue with is nobody really designs for colorblind people, but that's a topic for another for another lecture. So I'm not going to show you these because it doesn't work when I screen record them. I'm just going to leave the links here, and I think I'm going to talk about these in the sync class this week. But here's some videos I'd like you to watch. I'd really like you to watch it, especially the first one, the Corning glass, Day in the Life of Glass or something it's called. It's kind of silly, like why is a glass company doing this? But it's this amazing future of a day in the life of somebody where like almost every surface is an interface. And it's really well thought out. It's very inspiring. Like some of the items they deal with are things that I know that some of the students here are working on for their projects. So I think that it'll be quite inspirational from a design perspective, and because it's quite nice. It's very well designed. Are these things going to work out? I debate it. I don't know whether anybody wants an all glass see-through phone, but that's just me. And just for another perspective, AT&T used to do these videos where they kind of project what the future was going to be like and how AT&T was going to bring it to you. Turns out AT&T didn't bring any of this to you, but anyways, that can be what it may. This one from '80s is it's narrated by the guy with the mustache? I forget his name. Magnum PI. Anyway, it'll come to me. These ones are great, and actually, they got a lot of things right. But there's one interesting thing they did not get right, which is surprising to me. Maybe not surprising because they're AT&T. They have like video conferencing and all that kind of stuff, but everything is tied to phones. There's no mobile devices in these. So watch this and just go like, hey, they got some of these things right here. This is kind of cool. This is actually this happened, right? We can do this stuff. But then think about how they completely imagined it without the mobile device, without a smartphone being the key player in it. The 90s one is actually more, well, obviously it's closer to today, but there's some interesting predictions in there, and I don't love the way this one's shot. I don't know, it bothers me. It kind of bothers me, the storytelling aspect of it. And if you don't make it through it, that's fine, but it's interesting. Also look at what they got right and what they maybe didn't get right. But these are very much video artifacts of speculative design. All right, well, thank you for that. Sorry that I rambled a bit. I hope you found this interesting. It's taco time, and I'm going to speak to you on Wednesday, but otherwise I hope you have a great week. Thank you.